Danielle Carter never expected her day in court to go like this. Standing on the steps of the Jefferson County Courthouse in downtown Birmingham, Alabama, she took a deep breath, steadying herself. The historic building stood tall under the hot southern sun, its grand stone facade a reminder of both justice and oppression. How many people had walked these steps seeking fairness, only to be turned away? At 39 years old, Danielle had seen plenty of battles, both in her career as a community advocate and in her personal life. But today felt heavier. Today she wasn't just fighting for a cause. She was fighting for her younger cousin, Isaiah Carter, a 20-year-old college student wrongfully arrested during a peaceful protest. Isaiah had been among hundreds marching against racial injustice when outsiders turned the demonstration violent. Businesses were looted, cars were vandalized. But Isaiah had done none of that. Surveillance footage proved it. Still, the police rounded up dozens of young black men, charging them indiscriminately. Isaiah was accused of inciting violence and resisting arrest, even though video evidence showed otherwise. Danielle clenched her fists as she recalled his terrified voice from the holding cell the night he was arrested. "I didn't do anything, Danielle. They won't even listen to me." That was why she was here, to ensure someone listened. She glanced at her watch, 45 minutes until the hearing. Just as she took a step toward the entrance, a voice cut through the midday air. "Ma'am, hold up a second." She turned to see two uniformed officers standing near the courthouse entrance, both wearing smug expressions. The taller of the two, Officer Brent Holloway, stepped forward, folding his arms. "You here for the Carter case?" Danielle nodded, her posture firm. "Yes, I'm his legal advocate." Holloway smirked. "Didn't realize they let just anyone represent criminals these days." Danielle's jaw tightened. "Isaiah Carter is not a criminal, and if you'll excuse me, I have a hearing to attend." Holloway stepped in her path, his smirk widening. "You wouldn't mind a quick bag check, would you? Just a routine security measure." Danielle's pulse quickened. "Unless you have probable cause, I mind very much." His partner, Officer Rick Sanders, let out a low chuckle. "You're acting real defensive for someone with nothing to hide." Danielle knew this game. They weren't here for security. They were here to intimidate her. She inhaled slowly, then pulled out her phone. One call. That was all it took. "Agent Morrison," she said evenly, "I need you at the courthouse." Now. The officers exchanged glances. That name meant something. Minutes later, 3 unmarked black SUVs rolled up. FBI. The first door opened, and out stepped James Morrison, special agent in charge of the FBI's Civil Rights Division. Holloway stiffened. Sanders took a step back. Morrison approached with calm authority, scanning the officers before looking at Danielle. "Ms. Carter, are these men interfering with your legal duties?" Danielle crossed her arms. "Yes." Morrison turned to Holloway and Sanders, his voice like steel. "Care to explain why you're detaining a private citizen without cause?" Neither officer spoke. Morrison nodded toward the courthouse doors. "Step aside. Now." With barely concealed frustration, Holloway moved out of the way. Danielle walked past without another word. Inside the courtroom, Isaiah's case was dismissed within minutes. The next morning, headlines exploded. FBI intervenes after black woman harassed by police outside courthouse. The Jefferson County Police Department quickly announced an internal investigation into its officers. The body cam footage told the story clearly. Holloway and Sanders had targeted Danielle without cause. As for Isaiah, he walked out of court a free man, his record cleared. And Holloway? The FBI wasn't finished with him yet. Undeniable. Velma Hastings stood frozen for a fraction of a second, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She had spent years working to reform the system, advocating for justice, and mentoring young activists to navigate these very waters. Yet here she was, facing the kind of systemic intimidation she had fought against for so long. She could have walked inside and let it go. But Velma had never been the type to back down. Instead, she slowly turned her head to look Officer Dunn directly in the eyes. "I'd be careful about making threats, officer," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Because now, I'm making a call." Dunn's smirk faltered. Tully straightened, his mustache twitching. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded. Velma didn't answer. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, dialing a number she knew by heart. "Donovan, it's Velma." A pause. Yeah, I need you here. Now. She could see the flicker of recognition in Dunn's eyes, but he wasn't fast enough to mask it. They knew that name. Donovan Rhodes was her cousin and an FBI field agent. Tully stiffened. Who exactly are you calling? Before Velma could answer, the deep rumble of approaching engines filled the air. 3 black SUVs pulled up in front of the courthouse. The doors swung open, and 4 FBI agents stepped out. Their suits crisp, their expressions unreadable. Donovan, tall and imposing with a commanding presence, strode toward them. His badge flashed as he pulled it from his jacket. Agent Rhodes, FBI, he announced, his tone leaving no room for argument. Is there a reason my cousin is being detained outside of a public courthouse? Tully took a step back, stammering. No one's detaining anyone. We were just harassing a black woman trying to enter a legal proceeding? Donovan cut in sharply, his gaze like steel. This entire conversation has been recorded, and your conduct is now subject to a federal civil rights investigation. Dunn paled. That's not necessary, sir. We were just doing our jobs. Donovan stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to make the 2 officers squirm. Your job is to uphold the law, not to intimidate civilians because of the color of their skin. He turned to Velma. You good? She nodded, exhaling the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. I'm good now. Tully and Dunn stood frozen as Donovan motioned toward one of the agents. Escort Ms. Hastings inside. We'll handle them. As Velma stepped past the 2 officers, she allowed herself a small, victorious smile. Justice had just arrived at the courthouse, and it was carrying an FBI badge. Tried to argue that Jeremiah had been in the vicinity of the looting, but Linda countered with irrefutable timestamps and clear video angles proving his innocence. As the hearing progressed, Velma found herself watching the judge's face carefully. Would she be fair? Would she see the truth? Judge Hendrick leaned back in her chair, exhaling. The evidence overwhelmingly supports the defense's claims, she said, flipping through the files one last time. The charges against Jeremiah Hastings are hereby dismissed. Velma felt a rush of relief so intense it nearly made her dizzy. Jeremiah let out a shaky breath, his shoulders dropping from the tension he'd been carrying for weeks. Thank you, Your Honor, Linda said, her voice calm but triumphant. Velma reached for her nephew's hand and squeezed it. It's over, she whispered, barely believing it herself. Or so she thought. The confrontation outside. After signing the paperwork to officially clear Jeremiah's name, the 3 of them exited the courtroom and made their way back to the courthouse steps. The warm Atlanta sun should have felt like freedom, but Velma's instincts whispered that something was off, and she was right. Standing near the bottom of the courthouse steps were officers Tully and Dunn. They hadn't left. They were waiting. Jeremiah tensed beside her. Aunt Velma. I see them, she said quietly, gripping his arm to keep him steady. Linda, ever the composed attorney, lifted her chin as they descended the steps. But as soon as they reached the sidewalk, Tully smirked. Well, well, he drawled, arms crossed. Look who made it out so fast. Seems the courts are getting real soft these days. Dunn let out a low chuckle. Shame, huh? All that trouble, just to let a thug walk free. Linda froze in her tracks. What did you just say? Tully's smirk widened. I was just making an observation, counselor. No need to get all defensive. Velma saw red. She stepped forward, keeping her tone level. Are you seriously harassing us again? Outside a courthouse? In broad daylight? Dunn tilted his head, mock innocence dripping from his voice. Ma'am, we're just standing here. It's a public space. You're free to leave anytime. They were taunting her, trying to provoke her, trying to bait Jeremiah. Velma inhaled sharply, forcing herself to remain calm. She turned to Linda. Stay with Jeremiah. Then she pulled out her phone. Dunn laughed. Oh, what now? You gonna call your little civil rights group? Maybe give a speech about oppression? Velma didn't answer. Instead, she dialed a very specific number. Donovan, she said the moment the call connected. I need you downtown, right now. Dunn's smirk wavered. Who the hell are you calling? Velma didn't break eye contact. The FBI. When power walks in. Minutes later, black SUVs rolled up to the curb, tires crunching against the pavement. Tully and Dunn stiffened as 4 men in dark suits stepped out. The lead agent was none other than Donovan Rhodes, Velma's cousin and a senior FBI investigator. He strode forward, flashing his credentials. Agent Rhodes, Federal Bureau of Investigation. His gaze flickered over the two officers. And who the hell are you? Tully visibly gulped. We're just handling courthouse security. Funny, Donovan mused, because it looks a lot like harassment, and we've been recording since the moment we pulled up. He turned to Velma. You good? She nodded. I am now. Dunn was sweating. Look, there's no need to blow this out of proportion. We were just talking. No, you were threatening a civilian outside of a courthouse after she just won a legal case. Donovan stepped forward, voice low but firm. And that puts you on our radar. Starting now, Internal Affairs will be conducting a full review of your records. Tully's eyes widened. Wait, that's not... And, Donovan cut him off, if we find any patterns of misconduct, you can expect federal charges. Velma saw it. The moment the weight of actual consequences settled onto the two officers' faces. Tully's jaw clenched. Dunn's shoulders slumped. They knew they were finished. Linda stepped forward, arms crossed. Officers, I suggest you leave now, before this escalates any further. After a long, tense pause, they did. The two officers turned and walked away, their backs stiff with humiliation. A new beginning. Velma let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Donovan turned to her. You sure you're okay? She smiled, a real smile this time. More than okay. Because for the first time in a long time, justice didn't just feel like a possibility, it felt real. Before you start causing a scene, he said, his voice thick with authority and condescension. Velma exhaled slowly, reining in the fury boiling beneath her skin. She knew their game. Intimidation, humiliation, provoking a reaction. But she refused to play into it. We have nothing more to say to you, she stated firmly, grabbing Jeremiah's arm and attempting to step around them. Tully, however, moved directly into her path once more. Ma'am, I don't think you understand, he said, his voice dangerously low. We're just looking out for the community, making sure people like you know where you stand. Jeremiah tensed beside her, his fists clenching, his young rage simmering just below the surface. Velma squeezed his arm in warning. This was what they wanted. She wouldn't give it to them. Instead, she pulled out her phone, held it up, and hit a single contact. The voice on the other end answered immediately. Vel, everything okay? She didn't break eye contact with Tully as she spoke. Donovan, I need you at the Fulton County Courthouse, right now. Henderson scoffed. Oh, so now you're calling in reinforcements? Velma didn't blink. You could say that. Tully smirked, leaning in. Let me guess. Your lawyer? Or maybe some of those community activists that love stirring up trouble? Lady, no one's coming to save you. That's when she heard it. The unmistakable roar of approaching engines. 4 sleek black SUVs rounded the corner, tires screeching as they came to a halt at the courthouse curb. Doors swung open in unison, and a team of men in dark suits stepped out. The FBI had arrived. The power shift Velma's cousin, Special Agent Donovan Rhodes, stepped forward, his suit pristine, his movements measured. He adjusted the badge clipped to his belt, a golden emblem of federal authority that made Tully and his men freeze. I'd say that's my cue, Velma murmured, sliding her phone back into her bag. Tully took an instinctive step back, his smirk fading. Dunn shifted nervously, and even Henderson, who moments ago had seemed so self-assured, suddenly looked less confident. Officer Tully, Donovan said, his voice calm but commanding, I believe we have a problem. Tully straightened his stance, forcing a smirk. This ain't your jurisdiction, Agent. We were just having a friendly conversation. That's funny, Donovan said, folding his arms, because from what I understand, you've been harassing a civilian outside a courthouse. Twice. That sounds like a civil rights violation. Tully opened his mouth, but Donovan wasn't done. And it's about to get a lot worse for you, he continued, because I've got a federal complaint filed in real time. He held up his phone, showing the screen. And my men have been recording since we pulled up. Velma watched as realization dawned on the 3 officers. They'd walked right into a federal investigation. Henderson's jaw tightened. This is ridiculous. No, Donovan corrected. This is accountability. The reckoning within minutes, Internal Affairs had been contacted, and an official review into the officer's conduct was initiated. Tully, Dunn, and Henderson were escorted away by another MPD officer, their faces pale with humiliation. Velma let out a slow, measured breath. Justice wasn't always swift, and it certainly wasn't always clean. But today the system had been forced to listen. As she turned to Jeremiah, she saw the relief in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders easing. "See," she murmured, "we fight back, but we fight smart." He nodded slowly, respect shining through the exhaustion. A new beginning. As the sun began to set, Velma felt lighter than she had in weeks. Jeremiah was free. The officers who thought they were untouchable had been exposed, and, most importantly, a precedent had been set. As they walked away from the courthouse, Donovan fell into step beside her. "You good?" he asked. She smiled. "Yeah, I think I am." Because today, justice had finally looked like her. Oppression, watched too many families torn apart by corrupt officers who abused their authority. This time, however, she wasn't just going to walk away. This time, she was going to fight back. The call that changed everything. With her pulse still racing, she pulled out her phone and scrolled to a familiar contact. Donovan Rhodes, her cousin, an FBI special agent. She hit call. "Vel? Everything okay?" His voice was sharp, alert. Velma clenched her jaw. "Number I just got harassed outside the courthouse. 2 officers, Tully and Dunn. They blocked me from leaving, threatened me in front of witnesses." She inhaled shakily. "They're targeting me, Don." And Jeremiah, a tense silence stretched across the line. Then Donovan's voice came, cold and clipped. "Where are you now?" "In my car, outside the courthouse." "Stay put." The authority in his tone was unmistakable. "I'll handle it." Velma wasn't sure what he meant by handle it, but she knew one thing. When the FBI got involved, things moved fast. The reckoning 15 minutes later, just as she was about to start the engine and drive away, she saw them. 4 black SUVs pulling up alongside the courthouse. FBI agents stepped out, their presence unmistakable. Tully and Dunn, who were still loitering near the steps, straightened at the sight, their smug expressions faltering. They clearly hadn't expected federal agents to show up, not over a black woman they had assumed was powerless. Velma opened her door, stepping out just as Donovan approached. "Tully, Dunn." Donovan's voice was measured, calm, but with an edge sharp enough to cut. Tully sneered, though his shoulders were rigid. "What's this about?" Donovan didn't even blink. "We received a federal complaint regarding civil rights violations and harassment outside a public courthouse. Care to explain?" Dunn scoffed. "Federal complaint? Over what? We didn't do anything." Velma stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "You blocked my path. You threatened me. You targeted my nephew based on nothing but your own prejudice. And," Donovan added, tilting his head, "we have witnesses, cameras, reports from bystanders. Oh, and that little line about you people never learning? That alone makes this a hate crime investigation." The color drained from Tully's face. Dunn, ever defiant, crossed his arms. "This is ridiculous. We were just doing our job." "Your job?" Donovan raised an eyebrow. "You mean violating civil rights? Abusing your authority? Harassing a citizen outside of court?" By now, the FBI agents had surrounded the officers. Their demeanor was professional, but there was no mistaking the power shift. One of the agents, a woman with a clipboard and an earpiece, stepped forward. "Lieutenant Feldman from Internal Affairs has been notified. Officer Tully and Officer Dunn, you are now under federal investigation. You are being placed on immediate administrative leave, pending review." Dunn's mouth fell open. "Wait, what?" Tully was livid, but he wasn't stupid. He turned to Velma, his eyes burning with rage. "This is because of you," he spat. Velma met his gaze, unshaken. "No," she corrected. "This is because of you." Justice in motion. As the officers were led away, Velma finally allowed herself to exhale. Jeremiah, who had stepped out of the car, watched with a mix of awe and relief. "You really called the FBI," he murmured. Velma smirked slightly, still feeling the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Of course I did." Donovan turned to her, his expression both stern and approving. Next time, call me before it gets this far. She nodded. I didn't know it would escalate. He sighed. It always does. A new beginning. As the sun began to set over the courthouse, Velma felt something shift inside her. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just reacting to injustice. She had taken control. She looked at Jeremiah and saw hope. She looked at Donovan and saw strength. She looked at the courthouse, a place that had long symbolized oppression for people like her, and saw the possibility of change. Maybe, just maybe, justice was finally coming. Jeremiah swallowed hard, nodding as he processed everything. He never imagined that standing up for justice could put him at the center of something so much bigger. Velma started the car, pulling out of the courthouse parking lot. As she drove, she could feel the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. She had always believed in working within the system, mentoring youth, advocating for reform, and providing support where she could. But today had shown her that sometimes the system itself needed to be confronted head-on. The FBI moves in the next morning. Velma's phone rang earlier than expected. She glanced at the screen. Donovan. She answered quickly. Hey, Vel. Donovan's voice was brisk, professional. I need you to meet me at the federal building this afternoon. This case? It's bigger than I thought. Velma's heart skipped. What do you mean? There have been multiple complaints against that precinct, Tully and Dunn specifically. Civil rights violations, excessive force, fabricated charges against Black and Latino men. But nothing ever sticks because their superiors bury the complaints before they reach internal affairs. Velma's grip tightened on the phone. And now? Now? Donovan exhaled. Now we have a reason to dig deeper. Confrontation at the courthouse. By the time Velma and Jeremiah pulled up to the federal building, a storm of reporters had already gathered near the steps. The scene reminded Velma too much of the courthouse the day before, except this time, the power dynamic had shifted. Now the FBI was calling the shots. Donovan was waiting for them near the entrance, dressed in his dark FBI suit. He led them inside without a word, straight to a briefing room where several agents sat, reviewing files. Ms. Hastings, a woman with cropped hair and sharp eyes, greeted her. I'm Agent Reynolds. We're preparing to take formal statements from you and your nephew. Velma nodded. And what happens next? Reynolds glanced at Donovan, then back at Velma. We're going to pay Officers Tully and Dunn a visit. The FBI raid. Later that afternoon, Velma sat with Jeremiah in a cafe across from the precinct, watching as 3 unmarked black SUVs rolled up to the police station. Donovan had told her to stay put, but she needed to see it for herself. FBI agents exited the vehicles, badges displayed, guns holstered but visible. The precinct doors swung open and a lieutenant appeared, his face shifting from confusion to alarm as federal agents stormed inside. Minutes later, Velma saw Tully and Dunn being escorted out, handcuffed. Their faces were a picture of disbelief, the cocky arrogance replaced with something that almost looked like fear. Jeremiah exhaled sharply. I can't believe it. Velma, watching them get loaded into separate FBI vehicles, felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since stepping onto the courthouse steps the day before. Hope. Justice always finds a way. In the days that followed, the FBI's investigation exposed years of corruption within the department. Dozens of cases were reopened. Former victims stepped forward, their voices finally being heard. Tully and Dunn weren't just suspended, they were facing federal charges. Velma and Jeremiah's ordeal had been just one battle, but it had set off a chain reaction that led to real accountability. One call, one decision to stand firm, and an entire system was forced to answer for its crimes. Look with the other agents. Most were buried before reaching internal affairs, but we've been tracking patterns of misconduct within certain precincts. Your case isn't isolated. It's part of a much larger issue. Jeremiah swallowed hard. So, what happens now? Agent Peterson leaned forward, her fingers laced together. We're opening a formal investigation into Tully, Dunn, and any superior officers who may have enabled their behavior. We're also reviewing old cases for wrongful arrests and abuse of power. Velma exhaled, gripping the edge of the table. How can we help? Donovan slid a legal pad toward her. We need you both to give detailed statements about everything that happened, from the courthouse encounter to the threats they made. If you can recall any specific details, even minor ones, it could help us build a case. For the next 2 hours, Velma and Jeremiah recounted their experiences, leaving nothing out. The way Tully sneered when he handed Velma her ID, the veiled threats, Dunn's smug laughter, the suffocating weight of fear as they walked to their car. By the time they finished, the agents looked both troubled and resolute. "This isn't just about 2 rogue cops," Agent Doe said, flipping through his notes. "It's about a system that protects men like them. If we do this right, we're not just taking down Tully and Dunn, we're exposing the culture that allowed them to thrive." Velma nodded. "Then let's do it." The fallout begins. Over the next week, the FBI moved quickly. Donovan kept Velma updated as more officers came forward anonymously with reports of internal corruption, and dozens of civilians submitted formal complaints. A pattern emerged. Tully and Dunn weren't just racist bullies. They were part of a larger network of officers engaging in cover-ups, excessive force, and targeted harassment. By the time warrants were issued, the news had already leaked. Local and national media picked up the story, painting a damning picture of Atlanta PD's dark underbelly. Protests swelled outside the police headquarters, demanding justice. Then it finally happened. Velma sat in her living room, Jeremiah next to her, when a breaking news banner flashed across the TV screen. FBI raid Atlanta Police Precinct, multiple officers taken into custody. The footage was surreal. Tully and Dunn, handcuffed and being escorted out of the precinct, their faces twisted in shock and anger. Other officers, including a lieutenant, were also led away, heads down as reporters shouted questions. Jeremiah let out a shaky laugh. "I can't believe it. They actually got them." Velma placed a hand over his. "This is just the start. Justice has a new face." In the weeks that followed, the FBI's investigation expanded, revealing years of cover-ups and abuse within the department. Tully and Dunn faced federal civil rights charges. Their colleagues turned on them, cutting plea deals to reduce their own sentences. The police chief was forced to resign. And Velma, she became a voice for change. Her story sparked national conversations about systemic racism and police accountability. She was invited to speak at civil rights panels, on news programs, and in community forums. She hadn't set out to become an activist, but she refused to let this fight end here. As for Jeremiah, he returned to school, his head held high. The trauma lingered, but he knew he wasn't just a victim. He was part of something bigger. One phone call, one decision to stand firm, and an entire system was forced to answer for its crimes. Donovan's number with trembling fingers. It rang twice before he answered. "Velma?" His voice was sharp with concern. She swallowed hard, gripping the steering wheel. "Donovan, I think I was being followed." A pause. "Tell me everything." She described the SUV, the man in the baseball cap, how he'd matched her every turn until she pulled into the gas station. Donovan listened without interruption, then exhaled. "This isn't good," he said. "You did the right thing going somewhere public, but this means they're watching you." Velma closed her eyes, frustration and fear battling within her. "What do I do?" "We escalate," Donovan said firmly. "I'm looping in my superiors. This just went from an investigation to a security concern. I want you and Jeremiah to stay somewhere safe. Do you have family out of town?" She hesitated. "I do, but I can't just run." "I get it, but at least let me get some federal eyes on you," he insisted. "If they're bold enough to try intimidation, we need to make sure they don't take it further." Velma nodded even though he couldn't see her. "Okay, just keep me posted." "I will," Donovan assured her. "And Velma?" "Yeah?" "Stay sharp, and don't go anywhere alone." The noose tightens. By morning, Velma was back at work, but the unease hadn't left her. Jeremiah had moved back home temporarily, afraid to be alone. The weight of it all, his wrongful arrest, the threats, the surveillance, was wearing on him. Then just as she was getting ready to leave the office that evening, her phone rang again. This time it wasn't Donovan. It was an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Hello?" Silence, then a low voice. "Drop it." Her breath caught. "Excuse me?" "You don't want this fight," the voice continued. It was male, gruff, but unfamiliar. People like you don't win against the system. Let it go before you regret it. Then the line went dead. Velma stood frozen, the dial tone ringing in her ears. Her hands shook as she called Donovan back. "They just called me," she said, voice shaking. "They told me to drop it." There was no pause this time, no measured response. "I'm coming to you," Donovan said immediately. "Right now." The breaking point. 2 hours later, Velma, Jeremiah, and Donovan sat in her living room, a tense energy hanging in the air. Donovan had arrived with another agent, Special Agent Peterson, who now sat across from them, pen in hand. "This is escalating," Peterson said. "Surveillance, intimidation, direct threats. This isn't just a couple of rogue officers trying to scare you. It's a coordinated effort." "They think they can make me back down," Velma murmured. "They want you to back down," Donovan corrected, "because they know we're getting close to something bigger." Peterson folded her hands. "We're issuing a formal protective detail. You'll have plainclothes agents watching your home and your office. If anything else happens, you report it immediately." Velma exhaled. "And the investigation?" Donovan met her gaze. "It's about to go public." The next morning, headlines exploded across the news cycle. FBI investigates Atlanta police over racial bias and corruption allegations. The article named Tully, Dunn, and several others, citing multiple reports of misconduct, wrongful arrests, and abuse of power. Velma's name wasn't mentioned, but she knew this was the first domino to fall. By nightfall, more victims came forward, more officers were implicated, and then, the final blow. Tully and Dunn were suspended without pay pending the investigation. Their precinct was raided by the FBI. Justice, served weeks later, Velma stood in a federal courtroom, watching as Tully and Dunn sat in orange jumpsuits, their once smug faces replaced with sullen defeat. They weren't just being fired, they were being charged with civil rights violations, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Velma felt Jeremiah squeeze her hand beside her. "You did it," he whispered. She shook her head. "We did it." The journey wasn't over, but they had sent a message loud and clear. Justice always finds a way. Martinez, Jeremiah's attorney. "Velma," Linda's voice was urgent but steady. "I just got off the phone with a federal prosecutor. The FBI is preparing to take this investigation to the next level. They want Jeremiah and you to testify." Velma's breath caught. "Testify? Against Tully and Dunn?" "Yes, and possibly others," Linda confirmed. "The scope of this is widening. The FBI's findings are linking these officers to a pattern of racially motivated harassment and misconduct. Your statements, the courthouse incident, and the intimidation attempts, they're all pieces of a much bigger case." Velma sat down, gripping the edge of the coffee table. "What kind of case are we talking about?" "Federal civil rights violations," Linda said. "Obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and depending on what else the FBI uncovers, conspiracy charges." Velma exhaled slowly. "What does this mean for us?" "It means things might get rough before they get better," Linda admitted, "but it also means real accountability is coming." A tipping point. 2 days later, Velma and Jeremiah arrived at the FBI field office for their official testimony. Donovan greeted them at the door, his face unreadable. "Things are moving fast," he said as he led them down a quiet hallway. "You two are at the center of something much bigger than you realize." Inside the interview room, Special Agents Peterson and Doss were waiting. A large case file sat on the table between them. "We're grateful you're both here," Peterson said, flipping open the folder. "The evidence against Officers Tully and Dunn is mounting. Their records are littered with complaints that were buried or dismissed. But with your statements plus recent developments, the Department of Justice is looking at this as a potential systemic corruption case." Jeremiah shifted in his seat. "Recent developments?" Doss nodded grimly. "We've linked Tully and Dunn to several other officers who have been covering up excessive force incidents. It's a pattern, targeting Black and Latino citizens, coercing false confessions, intimidating witnesses." Velma clenched her fists. "How did this go unchecked for so long?" Peterson gave a tight smile. "The same way it always does. Power protects itself until someone fights back." For the next 2 hours, Velma and Jeremiah recounted everything. Every sneer, every veiled threat, the black SUV, the strange police visit, even the unknown call warning Velma to drop it. When they were done, Donovan leaned forward. "This is enough," he said. "We have what we need to proceed." Velma's pulse quickened. "Proceed with what?" Donovan exchanged glances with the agents before turning back to her. "Search warrants," he said, "and arrests." The fall of Tully and Dunn. The morning news broke the story before Velma even had time to process it. Breaking: FBI raids precinct in federal civil rights probe. Footage showed federal agents swarming the Atlanta police station, confiscating files, hard drives, and other evidence. By noon, both Tully and Dunn were in custody. Velma and Jeremiah watched the news unfold in stunned silence. "Multiple officers under investigation for misconduct," the anchor reported. "Sources say this probe could reveal widespread corruption within the department." Velma exhaled, tension draining from her body. "It's happening." Jeremiah swallowed hard. "Does this mean it's over?" Velma looked at him, her expression both relieved and cautious. "It means justice has started, but it's not over yet." Justice, finally. A month later, Velma sat in a courtroom, watching as Tully and Dunn were formally charged with civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. When the judge denied them bail, Dunn exploded in anger. "This is a damn witch hunt," he bellowed. Tully, on the other hand, sat in stunned silence. His badge, his power, his entire world had collapsed around him. Velma reached over and squeezed Jeremiah's hand. "We did it." Jeremiah exhaled slowly. "Yeah, we did." It had taken courage, resilience, and one crucial phone call. But in the end, justice had prevailed. Free to go. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck, and the weight of months of anxiety lifted in an instant. Jeremiah let out a shaky breath, his eyes glistening with emotion. Velma squeezed his hand, her own heart hammering from the sheer intensity of the moment. Linda patted Jeremiah's shoulder. "You're free, kid. It's over." As they stepped out of the courtroom, the reality of what had just happened began to settle in. They had won. The system had tried to swallow Jeremiah whole, but today they had beaten it. The celebration cut short. Outside the courthouse, a small group of supporters had gathered, including some of Velma's colleagues from the nonprofit. They clapped and cheered as Jeremiah and Velma emerged from the building. But even in victory, Velma's instincts told her something was off. Across the street, she spotted them, Tully and Dunn. They weren't in uniform, but their presence was unmistakable. Dunn leaned against a car, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Tully, standing next to him, locked eyes with Velma and smirked. Velma felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The message was clear. They weren't finished. "Let's go," she whispered to Jeremiah. They walked past their supporters, keeping their pace measured, controlled. But Velma knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The final warning. That evening, Velma's phone buzzed. A blocked number. She hesitated, then answered. A deep voice crackled through the line. "You think this is done?" Her breath hitched. The voice continued, low and threatening. "You got lucky today, but luck runs out." The call disconnected. Velma stared at the phone, her pulse hammering in her ears. She didn't need to guess who it was. Tully or Dunn, maybe both. A decision that changed everything. Velma sat in silence for a long moment. Then, without hesitation, she dialed Donovan. When he picked up, she didn't bother with pleasantries. "They just called me. A blocked number. They're still watching us." Donovan's voice was sharp. "I'll alert Peterson. If they're making direct threats, we have more than enough to move forward." Velma exhaled. "Good, because I refuse to live in fear." The next morning, arrest warrants were issued for officers Tully and Dunn. The charges: civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to intimidate a witness. Velma and Jeremiah weren't just survivors of a corrupt system, they were the ones who helped expose it. And this time, the law was finally on their side. Light of justice. The tables turn. For the first time, Tully and Dunn hesitated. The confidence that had once dripped from their every word and action now wavered. The presence of the FBI had shifted the power dynamics in an instant. Agent Arjun Doss stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Officers Tully and Dunn, We have some pressing matters to discuss with you. Tully sneered, trying to regain control. Oh yeah? And what exactly do you think we've done, Agent? Donovan held up a folder, flipping it open. Multiple complaints of harassment, excessive force, unlawful detainment, and, as of about 2 minutes ago, assault on a citizen caught on multiple recordings, right here on courthouse property. Dunn shifted uncomfortably. This is a joke. Does it look like we're laughing? Donovan asked coolly. A hush fell over the crowd. More phones were out, recording everything. The officers who had stood behind Tully and Dunn now took subtle steps away, clearly not wanting to get caught up in whatever was about to happen. Velma glanced at Jeremiah, who was still stiff with tension. She gave his arm a reassuring squeeze. This is it, she whispered. The truth is finally coming out. The moment of reckoning, Agent Doss pulled out a small device and hit play. A recorded voicemail, one of the anonymous threats Jeremiah had received, crackled through the air. You better keep your mouth shut, boy. You don't want to end up like the rest. The crowd murmured in shock. Jeremiah's jaw clenched. Velma felt her nails dig into her palms as she fought to keep her composure. Donovan's voice cut through the tension. We traced that call to a burner phone registered under a contact linked to Officer Dunn. Dunn's face went white. That's ridiculous, he sputtered. Tell it to Internal Affairs, Doss said, stepping closer. As of now, you're both under federal investigation. Tully opened his mouth to argue, but Donovan had already turned to the uniformed officers who had stood behind them moments before. Are you gentlemen going to make this easy, or do we need to escalate further? The officers hesitated. Then one of them reached forward and unclipped Tully's badge from his chest. Hand it over, he said quietly. Dunn flinched as another officer did the same to him. Their power was slipping through their fingers. Their arrogance crumbled under the weight of accountability. Justice in motion, Velma let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The system, one that had failed so many, was for once moving in the right direction. Tully and Dunn were led away, the FBI agents close behind. The crowd erupted, not in chaos but in cheers. Justice was rarely swift, but today at least, it had come knocking. Jeremiah turned to Velma, his voice thick with emotion. It's over. She pulled him into a hug. Almost, she murmured. But this is a start. And as they stepped off the courthouse steps, this time without fear, they knew that the fight for justice had only just begun. She felt something close to peace. A ripple effect, news of the confrontation spread quickly. Within hours, footage of Tully and Dunn being questioned by the FBI flooded social media. The images were unmistakable. Two officers once drunk on power, now facing the scrutiny they had so often avoided. By the next morning, mainstream news outlets had picked up the story. Headlines flashed across screens. Federal investigation launched into Atlanta PD officers over civil rights violations. Social workers called to FBI exposes police harassment case. Justice or retaliation, FBI steps in after officer intimidation at courthouse. Velma's phone buzzed relentlessly. Reporters, activists, even old college friends reached out to offer their support. Jeremiah's name trended on Twitter, with people calling him a symbol of resilience. But it wasn't just words. Action followed. The mayor's office issued a statement committing to a thorough review of the police department's disciplinary records. Internal Affairs reopened past complaints against Tully and Dunn, many of which had been conveniently buried over the years. That afternoon, Donovan called Velma with an update. The DOJ is watching this closely. If we can confirm a pattern of misconduct, this could lead to a federal consent decree. Velma's breath hitched. A consent decree meant long-term oversight of the department, a real systemic change. This isn't over, Donovan continued, but I need you to be careful. Publicity is a double-edged sword. Tully and Dunn may be out of power for now, but that doesn't mean everyone in their circle will be. Velma nodded, even though he couldn't see her. I understand. Justice in motion, Jeremiah returned to school a week later. The anxiety hadn't fully lifted, but there was a newfound confidence in his steps. Students stopped him on campus, some to offer support, others to share their own stories of racial profiling. He realized that his fight had never been just about him. It had been for every young black man wrongly labeled a threat. Velma, too, found herself stepping into a new role. She was invited to speak at community meetings, asked to consult on police reform panels. She hadn't planned to become an activist, but she couldn't ignore the impact of what had happened. One evening, as she walked home from a meeting, she received a final call from Donovan. "Tully and Dunn resigned today," he said. Velma stopped in her tracks. "Resigned? Not fired?" "It's politics," Donovan admitted, "but the investigation isn't stopping. They're done as cops, and if we find enough, they could still face criminal charges." She exhaled, processing the weight of it all. "That's something," she murmured. "That's something," Donovan echoed, "and it started with you." Velma hung up and looked at the night sky. The stars were barely visible beyond the city lights, but they were there, just like justice, sometimes obscured but always present, waiting for the right moment to shine. Done, their fate now in the hands of federal prosecutors. The weight of the charges against them was impossible to ignore. Patterns of racial profiling, intimidation tactics, and falsified reports were laid bare. For Velma and Jeremiah, watching this unfold was both empowering and unsettling. The battle was no longer just theirs. It had become a citywide reckoning. They had struck a nerve deep within the system, exposing cracks that could no longer be ignored. The road to accountability. As the days passed, more victims of police harassment came forward. Some had been afraid to speak up before, fearing retaliation, but now, bolstered by the FBI's involvement, they found their voices. Community organizers arranged forums where people could share their experiences, and local news stations aired segments about the growing demand for reform. Velma was invited to speak at one such gathering. Standing before a packed church hall, she took a deep breath, gripping the microphone. "I never wanted to be here," she admitted, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I never wanted my nephew to be at the center of this. But when injustice comes knocking, you either open the door and fight it, or you let it take everything from you. We chose to fight." The crowd erupted in applause, but Velma's mind remained focused on the long road ahead. The case against Tully and Dunn would take months, maybe longer. They would fight back, try to discredit their accusers, claim they were victims of a political witch hunt. But this time, they weren't the ones holding all the power. A shift in power. Meanwhile, at the Atlanta Police Department, the pressure mounted. Internal affairs, under scrutiny from the public and federal oversight, could no longer ignore what had been festering beneath the surface. Officers who had once turned a blind eye now found themselves forced to answer hard questions. Some resigned, unwilling to work under the scrutiny. Others doubled down in defiance, rallying behind their own, claiming that Tully and Dunn were being unfairly targeted. The city was divided. Some saw this as long overdue justice, others as an attack on law enforcement. One evening, as Velma sat at home going over legal documents with Jeremiah, her phone rang. It was Donovan. "Velma, we've uncovered something bigger," he said, his voice laced with urgency. "This isn't just about Tully and Dunn. There's a network, officers covering for each other, falsifying reports, even bearing evidence in police shootings." Velma swallowed hard. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was chilling. "What happens now?" she asked. Donovan sighed. "This case is expanding. The DOJ is considering a full-scale investigation into the department. It won't be quick, and it won't be easy. But you started something, Velma, and we're going to see it through. Justice on the horizon." For the first time in a long while, Velma felt something beyond fear, hope. She looked over at Jeremiah, who had been listening intently. He gave her a small, knowing smile. They had set this in motion. Now they would see it through. Reputation for fairness and zero tolerance for corruption presided over the hearing. She sat with an air of quiet authority, scanning the packed courtroom as Tully and Dunn took their seats at the defense table. Their attorneys, flanked by representatives from the police union, wore carefully composed expressions. But Velma, seated among the spectators with Jeremiah and Linda, could see the tension in their posture. They knew the tide was turning. A reckoning in court. The prosecution wasted no time. Special Agent Arjun Das, now embedded in the DOJ's civil rights investigation, presented the first wave of evidence. Body camera footage. The once discarded clips were played for all to hear, their words echoing like gunfire in the silent courtroom. He's just another punk kid. Nobody will believe him. The video showed Tully sneering, his voice dripping with disdain as he handcuffed a young black teenager whose face was bruised from unnecessary force. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Another clip captured Dunn laughing after an aggressive stop, muttering racial slurs just out of earshot of his victim. Their defense attorneys immediately objected, arguing the videos were taken out of context, but Judge Dequa was having none of it. She silenced them with a single sharp look before nodding at the prosecution to continue. Next came the buried complaints, dozens of them, statements from men and women across Atlanta, all painting the same grim picture: harassment, intimidation, unlawful searches, and falsified reports. Some of the victims sat in the gallery, their eyes burning with long-held rage as their experiences were finally brought to light. The defense attempted to counter with commendation letters, testimonials from senior officers claiming Tully and Dunn were good men. But it was too little, too late. The room had already shifted. The truth was too overwhelming to ignore. Public backlash and a broken system. Outside the courthouse, the scene was chaotic. Protesters chanted for justice, demanding the immediate termination of Tully and Dunn, while pro-police demonstrators shouted back, insisting the officers were being unfairly targeted. News crews captured the turmoil, broadcasting it to the entire city. Inside, Velma held Jeremiah's hand tightly as Judge Dequa delivered her decision. Given the gravity of the allegations and the strength of the presented evidence, I find probable cause for this case to proceed to trial. Officers Tully and Dunn will remain suspended pending further investigation, and bail will be set at... Before she could finish, Dunn exploded from his chair. "This is bull." His attorney yanked him back down, whispering furiously in his ear. But the damage was done. The display of arrogance and lack of remorse only solidified what the courtroom already knew. These men had spent years believing they were untouchable, but now they weren't. The beginning of the end. As Velma and Jeremiah exited the courthouse, the tension around them was palpable. Reporters clamored for statements, activists cheered, and the police union scrambled to contain the fallout. But Velma knew this wasn't the end, just the beginning of a long, grueling battle. That night, Donovan called her. "It's bigger than we thought," he said, voice grave. "The DOJ is now considering a full-scale probe into the Atlanta Police Department." Velma exhaled. "Good," she said. "It's time." Managed to cut deals or appeal their way to reduce charges, the fact that they were standing trial at all sent a powerful message. The days of unchecked power were over, or at least they were being challenged in a way that could not be ignored. A shift in the system. The aftermath of the hearing rippled through Atlanta. The police department, under mounting public pressure, announced sweeping internal reviews, and several high-ranking officers who had turned a blind eye to Tully and Dunn's actions were quietly placed on administrative leave. The police union, once defiant, found itself in a precarious position. Defending officers accused of misconduct was one thing. Defending men whose actions were now a matter of federal prosecution was another. In the days following the hearing, Velma noticed the change in her own community. Conversations that were once whispered in fear were now spoken aloud. Families who had suffered at the hands of officers like Tully and Dunn stepped forward, giving statements, organizing rallies, and demanding broader police reforms. Jeremiah, for his part, had changed too. The young man who once doubted whether speaking up could make a difference now carried himself with a quiet confidence. "You think they'll actually get convicted?" he asked one evening as they sat on Velma's porch, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. Velma sighed, considering the weight of the question. "I don't know," she admitted, "but the fact that they're even facing trial, that's something. And if we keep pushing, if people stay vigilant, this won't just be about them. It'll be about fixing what let them get away with this for so long." Jeremiah nodded, a flicker of determination in his eyes. "Then we keep fighting." The trial begins. Weeks later, as the trial officially began, the tension in the city reached a boiling point. The prosecution presented its case with devastating precision, using video footage, testimonies, and internal documents to paint a damning picture of Tully and Dunn's misconduct. The defense, as expected, tried to discredit the victims. They attempted to cast doubt on the FBI's motivations, claiming the case was politically driven. but public sentiment was against them. Every news outlet covered the trial relentlessly, exposing more details that had previously been buried. Then came the moment that turned the tide for good. A former officer, one of their own, took the stand against them. A man who had worked alongside Tully and Dunn for years, but could no longer stomach the corruption. His testimony revealed what many had long suspected. Their actions weren't just tolerated, they were protected. Reports were buried, complaints dismissed. The system had enabled them at every turn. Gasps filled the courtroom as he described the culture of silence within the department, a system designed to shield bad cops at all costs. Tully and Dunn sat stone-faced, their attorneys whispering furiously. They had gone from arrogant enforcers to desperate defendants, their futures hanging by a thread. Velma and Jeremiah sat in the back of the courtroom, hands clasped together. For the first time in a long time, justice didn't seem like a distant dream. It felt like something real, something within reach. The trial was far from over, but one thing was clear. Atlanta, and perhaps even the country, was watching. You changed everything, Velma. You made the call. You stood up. That takes courage. She exhaled, letting his words settle deep within her. Courage. That was what it had taken, wasn't it? Not just from her, but from Jeremiah, from Linda, from the other victims who had come forward, from the activists and journalists who refused to let this case be swept under the rug. Well, she said, staring at the sky, if this whole thing has taught me anything, it's that change doesn't happen unless we demand it. Damn right, Donovan agreed. And for what it's worth, this case is already making waves. A few of the officers who covered for Tully and Dunn are being investigated too. Internal Affairs is scrambling to get ahead of it. And you won't believe this. A couple of city council members are pushing for a new civilian oversight committee. Real change might actually be coming. Velma's grip on the phone tightened. It wasn't just about two corrupt officers anymore. It was about shaking the very foundations of a broken system. That's the best news I've heard in a while, she admitted, a small smile creeping onto her lips. They chatted for a little longer before saying their goodbyes. As Velma set her phone down, she turned to look inside the house, where Jeremiah was hunched over his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. She had no doubt he was pouring his heart into his latest assignment. Maybe about his experience, maybe about justice. She leaned back in her chair, watching as the last bit of sunlight dipped below the horizon. The storm had passed, but she knew this wasn't the end. There would be more battles, more injustices to fight. But now she knew something she hadn't before. She wasn't alone. She had allies. She had her voice. And she had the unwavering belief that no matter how hard they tried to silence people like her, truth had a way of rising to the surface. The fight wasn't over. But for tonight, she allowed herself to breathe. To sit in the warmth of a summer evening, sip her sweet tea, and know, without a doubt, that justice had been served. Denise Caldwell never expected her day in court to turn out like this. Harassed by racist police officers outside the Jefferson County Courthouse, she was threatened and humiliated as she fought for justice for Cameron Caldwell, who was wrongfully arrested during a peaceful protest. But Denise is not one to back down. When officers Rick Connors and Greg Dawson tried to intimidate her, she made a single phone call to her cousin, Donovan Ross, an FBI investigator. Minutes later, the weight of federal authority came crashing down on people who thought they were untouchable. By the end of the day, the tables had turned, and Connors and Dawson found themselves under investigation. One call, one act of defiance, and suddenly the system was forced to reckon with its own corruption. Denise Caldwell's story is more than just a story of injustice. It's a lesson in the power of an individual voice. In today's society, too many people are threatened, harassed, and treated unfairly because of where they come from, the color of their skin, or their beliefs. But Denise's story shows us that one voice can make a difference. 1. Don't be silent in the face of injustice. If you or someone around you has been wronged, speak up. Justice only exists when we fight for it. 2. Document the truth. In today's technological world, evidence is power. Video, audio, photography, all can be powerful weapons in defending the truth. 3. Connect with people who can help. Whether you are a lawyer, activist, or human rights organization, Don't be afraid to seek support from those who are willing to stand up for justice. Social media is a tool. Use it wisely. Share important stories, spread the truth, and put pressure on systems that need to change. Justice doesn't happen by itself. It comes from those who fight for it. If you believe in change, don't be afraid to act. Leave a comment and share your thoughts. Like and subscribe to continue following inspiring stories about justice and truth. Bell.